I'm Howard Osborne, and I'm with Gillian Lindsay and Christine Bloxham, two authors of books about Flora Thompson, and we're here to talk about Flora. It's her 150th birthday. I haven't brought a cake or anything, but I thought we'd take this opportunity to have a little chat about her life, the works that she's done, that she's made, and also her legacy. So, first of all, Gillian Lindsay, um, who was Flora Thompson?
So Flora was apparently a very ordinary cottage girl, but she grew up to display quite exceptional literary skill. I think the most important aspect of her character is that she was entirely self-taught. Her education locally in the local school was very basic, but when she left home, she really embarked on a programme of education, particularly when she got to Bournemouth as a young married woman, where she used her local library extensively. She would order books on, say, Dickens or the Thackeray or the Brontes, read them, and she absorbed so much that in the future she wrote 40 essays about individual literary characters, all of which were published. So this is part of, people think she's a one book author, Lark Rise to Candleford. She's not. She wrote another book. She wrote lots and lots of published stories and articles. But it all started with this self-education, which took great determination, I think.
And you mentioned that the book she's most famous for, or the trilogy she's most famous for, Lark Rise to Canford. So Christine, what's that about?
It's about her childhood in North Oxfordshire.
Hmm.
She was a child in the 1880s, which was a time of a lot of change when a lot of agriculture was failing and people were moving to the cities and so on. But she wrote this incredibly evocative description. I think it's one of the best descriptions I've ever written of ever read of what it was like to live in a country cottage. She described what was on the walls, the ornaments in the house, ways of cooking, things like that. As a social historian, I found that absolutely enchanting, and it taught me so much.
And do you think there's something about the style in which she wrote the book, or particularly Lark Rise, but the three books? Is there something in the style that really helps us understand what that time period of time was like?
I think, yes, I think there is. I mean, it's a strange book because it's not an autobiography and it's sort of not a novel. There isn't really any narrative to it, just sort of odd little bits and pieces. And so it's quite a bitty sort of book, but I think it really does tell you an awful lot about that time. And there aren't very many authentic voices writing about their own experiences from that sort of condition, because most agricultural labourers' daughters or stonemasons' daughters didn't have the right sort of education to be able to write books.
So and Jill, you mentioned that she actually wrote extensively, and this is one of the last things she wrote. She's one of the latter pieces of work that she did,
Mm.
and but it caught a mood that this evocation of the 1880s and beyond. That's something that was picked up and seems particularly important in the late 30s.
Well, of course, it actually came out just before the Second World War and was much read during the Second World War. I think this was a generation, we have to remember, that had lived through both wars. Most people, or many people, it was only 20 years between them. If you think about it, Flora lost her brother in one war and her son in the other, and that was common. So something comforting, something that made people remember perhaps their childhood or things their parents had said. It just helped in a very difficult time. And she was very quickly on the bestseller lists. It just, as you say, it hit the mood of the time. Very often, it's not just the right thing, it's the right thing at the right time, isn't
Yes,
it?
and perhaps it became a right time again in the 2000s, when it
Yes.
was then adapted by the BBC.
Yes, although I did go to one performance of Lark Rise in a marquee, and a lot of people there were saying they didn't like the BBC programme. And the person I was sitting next to, I can't remember, it might have been Keith Dewhurst or Bill somebody. He said, "Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, Flora Thompson is greater than the BBC," which I thought was a wonderful quote.
I was just wondering, yes, and so Christine, I was just wondering, again, we talked about the style. Do you think that it makes it, because that you mentioned, the way in which she wrote things, do you think that means that it's ripe for adaptation? It's the sort of thing that someone can take hold of and then write their own screenplay?
It is difficult. It is so bitty. And I thought that the BBC version sort of lost the innocence. It didn't have much about the village, and it was more about Candleford and the vast number of people. And I'm afraid they gratuitously changed things so much. They changed the names of people, of relationships. I went through each episode and I made a long list of all the things that was actually different from the book. And I hated every minute of it, I'm afraid.
Oh dear. But it was tremendously popular. And but of course this actually then spurred, well, not necessarily this chain of events, but a number of people have been spurred to then go and find the real places, the real people. And actually that's something, Christine, that's something you've done, isn't it? You went and found the world of Flora Thompson. You wrote a book specifically detailing some of the real people and places.
I was working on the back of a lot of other people's research. There were various articles that people had written, but I worked in the Oxfordshire County Museum as assistant keeper of antiquities, and as part of my job, it was to learn about what life was like in Oxfordshire at that sort of time. And so I used the book very much as a sort of template, and I did lots of research on it. And as a historian too, I looked at census returns, and there's all sorts of little clues you can get. And I was incredibly fortunate because I met a man called David Watts, who is the historian par excellence of Bicester. And he was actually a cousin of Flora Thompson's. And he gave me an enormous amount of real, genuine background knowledge, which helped me to work out her family tree, the first family tree I ever worked on.
Well, so she was very interested in her own family tree. She had she did wonder if she was related to someone who had stood up for Catherine of Aragon, in Parliament and things like that. But you found that she's related to someone who appears in other literary works. So is it Thomas Arnold, the person
Oh
who appears in
God,
Tom
I
Brown?
can't remember. I really can't remember now. It probably was. But I most intriguingly found out that I'm actually related to her back in the Middle Ages somewhere.
No. Again, this need to go and find these places to really understand that it's really evokes stuff. So, Jill, you again, you wrote probably I was going to say a seminal work. One of the, I mean, there was a biography written immediately after she died, wasn't there? A brief sort of an essay style. But you wrote one of the first biographies of her, Story of the Lark Rise Writer in 1990. Is that right?
Yes, I think I made one great error. In those days, it wasn't quite so easy. There was no internet, so you couldn't just go onto Ancestry and bring up the census returns and so on. And I used Margaret Lane's little essay, which is at the front of a country calendar. And in it, she said that Flora's uncle Tom was somebody called Rechab Holland of Buckingham. And I thought, oh, good, that gives me that name. And I put it in my book, and I was quite wrong. Christine can probably explain the real Uncle Tom, but I think it's an object lesson in do your own research. Don't take other people's work for granted. You can't be sure it's right, and it wasn't. So, Christine, if I can ask you a question, can you explain? I did eventually put it right in my next book, or rather issue, that it was not Rechab Holland at all. It was Thomas. Oh gosh, don't you?
No,
Yes.
I've got the
Yes.
book.
Uncle Tom was Thomas Whiting of
Right,
Twyford.
of course it was. Yes, I've got it here.
Yes.
Yes. He was actually married to her aunt.
Mm.
And so he was quite a close relation. And she went to see him a lot. It seems incredible because she wrote that she used to walk across the fields to Twyford on her own or with her little brother when she was only about 11 or 12. I don't think children would be allowed to do that now.
No.
He seems to have been something of a role model.
Yeah.
I think he was, yes, because he was a cut above the others in a way. He was, as a shoemaker or bootmaker, he was obviously a little bit more cultured, maybe. He loved books, and she used to borrow books from his library, and she had very few books at home. And so this must have been such a joy to her, I think.
Mm. And
So so
her mother tended to think she was wasting time when she was reading, whereas Uncle Tom encouraged her to read, which is just what she needed.
so she would you say books for her were a source of learning, but were they also perhaps a refuge in a rather narrow place?
Mm, very likely, very likely.
Yeah,
But
but
anybody who writes, it's a definite lesson. Do your own research. One bit that did work, we were in Bournemouth one time and we were told of a very elderly gentleman who'd lived next door to Flora as a young married woman in Bournemouth. And he was a pharmacist with a great interest in photography. Now, Flora hated being photographed. She wasn't pretty and she knew it, bless her. But he persuaded her to pose for him with her children, one child on her knee and then the other one, to send the pictures to her mother. And we managed to track him down. He was in his 90s. So that was a bit of a triumph that kind of went on the scales of my mistake about Uncle Tom. The photographs are lovely, I think.
so as well as being somebody who was very literary, wanting to read a lot, as you mentioned, really took up the pen, started writing, and became a tabletop writer. And throughout her life, after she left, we're rather skipping through some of the story of Lark Rise Writer, but when she grew up, she then moved away, but she became a lifelong writer and encouraging other people to write as well.
Yeah.
And some of that a lot of that was based on she also loved to go for long walks and
Yes.
write about that in Peveril as part of the Peveril Society and writing the Peveril Papers. Is that right?
Yes, well, in the Catholic fireside, she alternated Peveril Papers one month, which would be, let's say, January, all about snowdrops coming out or whatever. And another month, she would do a literary one when she would feature Dickens or Thackeray or something. So she had these, she was multitasking and had great skills. She wasn't, she wasn't a one book person. She wasn't a one interest person. She was very knowledgeable about wildlife and the world of nature, and she had taught herself about literature, and in doing so, gained literary skill, I think. Do you agree, Christine?
Absolutely, yes.
Mm.
And she was interested in poetry.
Yes, I think Joe has reprinted Bog Myrtle and Pete. It was a bit sad in a way. She was convinced that she was a poet. She was a pretty average verse maker, really, but she didn't have the confidence to realize what she was good at was writing about things she knew, not fiction. She did try one fiction book, and it's a disaster. It really, really isn't very good. Librarians have some difficulty knowing where to catalogue Lark Rise to Candleford. It's not fiction. It's not strictly speaking autobiography. It's not biography. It's an I'm told by librarians it's a book you can't actually easily categorize, which is kind of Flora all over, I think.
And it's very curious that it was actually published by the Oxford University Press because they didn't publish fiction.
Exactly. And so they called it, I think, am I right, Christine? They called it autobiography.
I think so, yes.
It only sort of was. Actually, her publisher, Geoffrey Cumberledge, became a very great friend. During the war, he was most supportive. He sent her paper when she was running out of paper. His wife would send her tea. She made friends, although she was a quiet, rather reserved person. People who met her liked her a lot. So I think she must have been a delightful woman.
Isn't it a shame we'll never meet her?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Though, in a sense, we kind of learned something about her from some of her works. And we talked about her poetry earlier. Actually, she wrote, you published in your book, Jill, one of a short verse by her, which seems to sum her up. I'm going to have an attempt at reading it if it's right with you. So it's called The Earthly Paradise. It's like, when I am old, give me for heaven a little house set on a heath, the blue brick hills behind, the blue sea before, the brick floor scoured crimson, the flagstones like snow, the brass taps and candlesticks like gold. And there, in my soft grey gown between the hollyhocks, upon a day of days, I would welcome an old poet and pour him tea and walk upon the heath and talk the sun down. And then by the wood fire, he would read me the poems of his passionate youth and make the ones praising friendship above love.
Now
Seems
that
to
I
capture
think
it, doesn't it?
She's talking about Ronald McPhee there. Now, you know about Ronald McPhee, I'm sure. She met this, he was actually a qualified doctor, and he wrote a poem about the sinking of the Titanic. And the magazine he wrote that in invited essays from people about the Titanic. And Flora won. And they met, this Dr. McPhee and Flora, not very often, but they met. I think she was a bit, I won't say in love with him, but I think he encouraged her work, and very few people did. He became her mentor, if you like. But it was poetry he encouraged. He completely missed, as she did at that stage, the fact that she was a writer of non-fiction.
Yes, so perhaps went to something of a dead end. Didn't really tap into
Exactly.
what
Yeah.
she could deliver
Yeah.
best.
So
Sorry, were
I
you
think
saying
he
something,
was in
Christine?
Gates of Eden, her one and only very long novel, which Joe has published or printed. Have you read it, Gates of Eden?
Yes, yes, I have.
Yeah, she's not a novelist, is she?
No,
No.
I didn't know it published it actually. I'd have to get hold of a copy.
Yeah, there are little bits of it that are very beautiful descriptions, but her characters and her development of a story don't quite work. It's a shame, but she had the sense not to publish it. And after she died, her daughter Winifred sent it to Geoffrey Cumberledge and said, "What about publishing Mum's book, Gates of Eden?" And he very tactfully got out of it and said, "The time isn't right." And it never was. It never was.
I had to borrow photocopies from the University of Texas to read things like that. I think it's such a shame that all her papers were sold to America rather than going to Oxford University to the Bodleian. And in those days, I don't know what it's like now, you could only borrow photocopies, you had to send them back afterwards.
Yeah, I actually went to Texas. They're very welcoming. And in a way, Christine, if they hadn't bought it with their oil money, I don't know what would have happened to her papers. Oxford University Press didn't have the money to buy it. And I think Winifred's friend, because Winifred died fairly early, was wanting to sell, not give.
That's a shame, a real shame.
Yes. Um, but they take the greatest care of it in Texas, and they will supply copies. But as you say, you do have to send them back.
I'm glad to hear that because they hadn't a clue what they'd got when I wrote to them. They just had a little sort of hand list, and I had to sort of guess from that what it was.
Well, when I went, I sort of catalogued it and gave them a list of what they'd got.
Good for
So
you.
they should have that now. But they were very welcoming to me. When Ruth went, Ruth, who's written Without Education or Encouragement, she's an American and she didn't find such a welcome. So I think I was welcomed and very nicely treated as a British person. I was a bit unusual. Um,
Interesting. I'd love to have gone there, but I couldn't afford it.
well, I must admit, I never would have done, but my husband said, "You ought to go," and we did it for our silver wedding. It was his gift to me.
Oh, how lovely.
And he's got the courage. I'm not good at aeroplanes and long distance and so on, but he organised it all, bless him, and that's how I came to go to Texas. It's no credit to me, it's all credit to my husband.
So,
Husbands are very useful. His mine was an enormous encouragement to me as well.
what are your opinions on Flora's spouse?
That's your question, I think, Gillian.
Well, he's got a very bad reputation, largely from the play, where he says, think about me and our children." And I must admit, I did meet, I think it's the Keith Dewhurst play, and he said he put that in at the end of an act as a bit of drama. He had nothing to base it on. And I think poor her husband's got an unrealistic reputation. I don't imagine he put it first. I mean, the post office came first in the war when she was running the telegraph side of it. That came first. But she had a room where she wrote. And when they moved to Dartmouth, he built her a writing room. Now, you don't do that if you're discouraging your wife, do you?
No, of course you don't.
Those few lines in a play gave him a reputation I personally think he didn't deserve.
I think it was really irresponsible to write those lines.
Mm. I mean, he was apparently, from those who met him, he was a typical, if you like, civil servant. His shoes were always polished. He expected all the post people working in the post office to be immaculate, polished shoes, polished buttons. What he would have thought of all the postmen in their shorts now, I can't imagine. He was a stickler for things being correct. That's for sure. A lot of people will have testified to that. But that doesn't say anything about his marriage, does it?
No, it doesn't.
People are very different in their workplace and behind closed doors at home. Either way, they can be much nicer or much less nice. I suspect he relaxed and was better at home than he's given credit for, but I don't know.
In terms of the detail of Lark Rise, if we come back to perhaps her most famous work, what do you think we've learnt about that period of time, the 1880s?
Christine's question as a social historian.
Thank you. Well, I think it's the minutiae of life. You get sort of broad brushstrokes generally from historians, and Flora just goes into so much detail about life, about the actual children's games that were played in the playground. And even then she was saying, oh, these are dying out, they won't be here in the next generation. But in fact, they were. And I think there still are some various children's games played in the playground at school. But she gives such graphic details, and her description of May Day and the way it was celebrated in the countryside, and the descriptions of killing the pig, which is maybe a bit gory, but how they used absolutely every single bit of the pig because it was so important to them, because they were living on a very fixed income. And I suppose how resourceful they had to be because life was hard.
One thing that struck me from the book was that it's very easy for us to think of this, a book written in the late 30s, 1930s, about the 1880s and being a look back at then and now. But actually, some of her details of that time in the 80s, and particularly her descriptions of Sally and Dick, Richard and Sarah in real life. They're actually describing, they're the oldest people and probably the most prosperous people in Hamlet. They in turn are an opportunity for her to describe a time before that, a time pre-enclosure.
Absolutely. Yes, because they'd inherited things from before enclosure. And before enclosure, the labourers actually had much more freedom, really, because they had extra land on the common where they could maybe have the odd cow or something. And they had other ways of making money. Sally was a lace maker. Queenie kept bees. And again, the description of their house is absolutely wonderful. I've used it as the inspiration for making a doll's house.
Mm.
It's absolutely amazing.
She even describes the smell of the house. She said you could walk into their house or something like it and think, oh, old Sally's. It was compounded of, was it brewing, and what were the compounds of the wonderful smell of?
Was it preserving as well?
Yes.
She used to make jams and things, didn't she?
Yes.
And pickles
and that's a very evocative thing, isn't it?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Very evocative. Yes. She was also, I think, interested in the future. She did say somewhere that it would be good for children to do a sort of doomsday book of their village for the future. And I agree. I take children around our village and they're much more interested in the history of their village than kings and queens and battles and bishops. And Flora knew that. And she said she thought that should have happened.
I think it does to a little extent. I remember that my younger son, when we lived in Oxford at the time, he did a bit of a history of Headington, which was where his school was. And I thought it was really nice to do a bit of local history. Local history can be much more interesting than national history in some respects, I think.
Definitely. And it appeals to children.
Yes.
Definitely.
So do you think there's something to take away from that? This notion that, so she was a lifetime writer. She spent substantial periods of her time bashing away at a typewriter on a kitchen table, and she was encouraging other people to write. And as you just mentioned, she thought perhaps children ought to be doing doomsday accounts and various things. So do you think that that's really a call to arms or a call to pen for all people to have a little go at writing? And
I think it would be nice to do that. I mean, wouldn't it be lovely if a lot of people could leave their own biographies for their grandchildren and things like that and future generations? I'd love to know more about what some of my ancestors thought and felt. And my grandfather's diaries should be fascinating because he was in the Navy and he went all over the world. But they're all very practical. And he was a gunnery officer, and they're all about how the guns fired and what their ranges were. And I wanted to know what life was like in China when he was there and that sort of thing.
Because what we think is ordinary to us is not going to be at all ordinary to the next generation, is it?
That's true. I mean, life has changed so much in my lifetime.
Oh, tremendously. I know every generation probably thought that. I mean, if you'd been around when the railways came, it would have seemed like the end of the world that a line went through your village or town with great big puffing, steam trains. But I think the internet has changed things very quickly for us.
Absolutely. I mean, when I first started doing the research in the 1990s, I went down to the local polytechnic where I had a friend who was a lecturer, and we looked up on the internet, and there was absolutely nothing about Flora Thompson.
No, no. And nor could you, sign up to Ancestry or Find My Past and just bring up all the census returns and so
Yeah.
on. Research is
Oh, it's
much
made such a
better now.
difference.
Yes, but equally, the next generation won't have letters and because it's all emails, isn't it?
That's right.
Even photographs aren't printed.
Yes.
They're on your computer, and if your computer goes eventually, I mean, I think, the few photos we've got of Flora are very precious.
Well, it's happening now because I've gone through so many different generations of computers and ways of recording things from computers, which are now totally obsolete.
I mean, I run the local history society in our village, and we've got some things on little discs that there is nothing you can play them on now. And
Yeah.
yet at the time they seemed worthwhile. Paper and pen and printed pictures still have a great use. And luckily, Flora lived in that era, not ours.
Yes, I agree.
So in both your cases, if you were to summarize what you think and I was going to say what legacy we have, but what would we say to younger people when looking at Flora Thompson's life, her works? What can we learn from that, and what can they take away from that? I'll
I
start with
wonder
you,
how many
Jill.
young.
Sorry,
Sorry.
Christine.
Go on, Christine.
Well, I wonder how many young people will read it, to be honest.
Hmm. Hmm.
The television version would have put me off for life. I'm sorry, I hate to say that, but no, there's something that I just cringed over. But I do hope they will learn about the countryside because there is so little of Flora's countryside left now, I think. It's very, very hard, isn't it? It's going to be quite alien to them.
Mm.
Perhaps they'd listen to some of the folk songs and things. So I think those are quite enchanting.
And Jill, what would you say is the takeaway?
If you can learn anything from her life and work, it was that your circumstances don't have to limit you. And that possibly even applies to people with disabilities. Flora knew many poor people, and she had this lovely saying, I think, I can't remember where, the nearer the bone, the sweeter the meat. You could do something if you made an effort, whatever circumstances. I mean, she was born into quite limited, almost poverty-stricken circumstances, and yet look what she achieved. So if ever there was a role model for never mind what life's given you, do something with it. And she did.
And maybe use a paper and pen or a typewriter?
Exactly.
Well, it's been wonderful talking to you both. And again, your books are still in print, aren't they? Or you can get hold of mine. I know I have. So we'll leave some details about how we can get hold of your books because I think
You can
they're
get
well
those
worth a read.
mine anyway through Joe Smith.
Yeah, yeah. Fantastic. Well, it was great talking to you, Gillian Lindsay and Christine Bloxham. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Bye, Christine.
Good to talk to you both.